Irene, tell us about the connection with your memoir and with your radio pieces.
Well, actually what happened was I started writing a memoir, and my idea for it was that I had to visualize it first. I'd never written a long prose work. So I tried to picture in my mind. I decided it should be 162 pages long, and it should have a blue cover and be a moderate-sized book, not a big, wide book. And I thought if I physically saw it that way, I could just launch right into it, and I wouldn't have to agonize every single day. But of course, it didn't turn out that way. But what I did get from that was a sense that if I could make it firm in my mind, I could proceed. I could at least keep going. So what I wanted was little chapters, little pieces that stood by themselves, had a beginning and a middle and an end, and were understandable that way, but that also were part of this bigger picture of the whole memoir. So I started writing it that way, titled each little section that way. And then in the middle of this, after I finished the first draft, my friend John Nakashima, who works for PBS, was talking to me one day, and he said, some people at the station would like for you to do a short commentary every couple weeks on public radio. And I said, well, what about? And he said, well, anything you want it to be about, anything you're interested in. So I got that manuscript out and looked back through it, and I saw that I could do something in 5 to 7 minutes. That was their specified amount of time. And I could change it just a little bit so that it was more comprehensible. Because when you're reading, you have the option of stopping and backing up and kind of appreciating the language or rereading for meaning. Whereas on the radio, even though they save these, most people have got to get it the first time or they won't get it at all. So I think I simplified it somewhat. And that troubled me a little bit, because then when I went back to try to write the memoir, now I'm having to revision the whole thing. I think in some ways it improved it because it made it clearer, but in other ways it emphasized too much the narrative quality over the quality of the language.
Yeah.
And I care very, very much about the quality of language, no matter if I'm writing a poem or an essay. So that's where I am with it right now. It's kind of problematic.
What changes do you see?
I am rolling.
Okay.
What changes do you see developing in Appalachian literature now?
Well, I think it's a really, really exciting time. It's also confusing. Usually when things are exciting, they get pretty chaotic. There are a lot of directions that people are taking off in, so it's becoming much richer and more multi-layered kind of literature. When you compare it with, say, the history of Southern literature, kind of stages that it goes through, when I think back about older poet laureates of West Virginia, Louise McNeil, for example, the situation for her as a writer was very, very different than it is for me, and my situation is very, very different than a younger writer like Jean Ann Phillips or even Maggie Anderson, and they're only 10 years or so younger than me. So it's developing very fast, but the big problem, we all hear anecdotes like this, but Louise McNeil said when Gauley Mountain came out, she was invited to New York to give a reading. And she was in an elevator, and there was a man and his wife, and the wife, I think, was a poet. And the man said to Louise, "You're that poet from West Virginia, aren't you?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I see you bothered to put your shoes on for this event." And she said at that point, she thought, do I really want to be part of a literary culture that thinks that way? And I believe ultimately her answer to herself is, no, I don't want to be part of it. I think also of James Still, who pretty much retired to Wolf Pen and that area and observed everything there was to observe there. He's a wonderful, wonderful writer, but he really did have that sense of the impossibility of actually stepping out into the mainstream
Right.
of American literature. At one point, he said Princeton, after River of Earth came out, Princeton invited him to come give a reading. And he said he thought and thought about it. And finally, he wrote to them and said, I don't think I will. And of course, they were curious about why. And he said, it's because I don't have the right clothes to wear. Now, you know, he said that tongue in cheek, but I think what he was saying is, I'm not the same kind of person, and therefore I'm not going to be taken the way I want to be taken. So I felt, I mean, half of my life I felt that way. The other half is much more expansive. You know, I went away to school, I traveled around a lot. That half feels more at ease in the literary culture at large. But I feel very sympathetic with figures like James Still and Louise McNeill. Mm-hmm. And my tendency is to want to say, I don't really say it, well, to hell with you then. And that's pretty much what Louise said. So this generation of writers has an entirely different situation, a much more accepting situation. And that also can be double-edged, because you have to ask yourself, what are they accepting us for? What's the mainstream culture accepting us for? And to the extent that they're accepting us because we feel different to them, we feel somewhat alien and therefore intriguing, then I don't think that's a good thing. I'm not saying that the differences between Appalachian culture and mainstream culture are not interesting. They are. They're very interesting to explore, and we have a whole body of scholarship exploring them, and a lot of novels and some poetry building on those differences. But I don't think that is the really strong part of the writing. I'm going to...
And let's wait for this car.
Okay.
I'm rolling though, and action.
What is most important to you about writing poems?
I think the language itself. I'm in love with language, and I also feel very humble in the face of language. I think a lot of times when I'm teaching poetry workshops, say undergraduates, they want to start out with a subject they already have in mind and a conclusion they already have in mind. In other words, they're much more interested in, quote, meaning than they are in craft, artistry, the music of the language, the sound of the language, what you can do with the syntax. Where I'm just the opposite. I want language to lead me, not the other way around. Mm-hmm. Billy Collins wrote someplace that sort of amateur readers of poetry want to grab a poem, tie it to a chair, and force its meaning out of it, even if they have to beat it up to get it. And that kind of attitude, I think, is totally wrong-headed. I really do. So anything that leans toward thinking of meaning first, for me, defeats the purpose of discovery in art. How can you discover something if you think you already know it when you're just beginning? So all the exercises I put together for my classes and the kinds of exercises I give myself, in other words, the assignments I give myself, I try to make them as open-ended as possible and to let the language lead. The language, after all, passed through Shakespeare's mind. And every man and woman that you can think of, every housewife, every farmer, all of these people put their wisdom into the structure of that language and the meaning of those words and the sounds of those words. And that's what I want to tap into. I am humble in the face of language, and I want it to lead me rather than the other way around.
Very good. I agree.
The end. And as Minnie Pearl says, I'm through talking now. Bravo.
Going.
What were we talking about at lunch when we interrupted ourselves?
No idea.
After you got bored hearing the story of my romantic life, we passed on to something else. I forget what it